one of the leading pieces of literature on innovation that you and I both have been drawn to is Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma idea that when you're in a really highly structured historical institution, it tends to be set up to serve a specific world that may no longer exist when new technology comes to the fore. And you recently have decided as an organization to make an acquisition of ODR.com and Resourceful Internet Solutions.
We really feel like we've just found a new set of partners for scoping out and planning for the future of dispute resolution. We've been really busy at the AAA before we joined forces with this team at ODR and RAS, building our own generative AI tools. We have tools for our customers. We have tools for our teams in-house. We're going full steam ahead on finding tools that both make our internal operations better, faster, stronger, and our services to users better, faster, stronger. Welcome to 2030 Vision, AI and the Future of Law, your go-to podcast focused on exploring the transformative impact of artificial intelligence on the legal industry. We're your hosts, Bridget McCormack and Jen Leonard, and together we'll navigate the rapidly evolving landscape of artificial intelligence, uncovering the opportunities, addressing the risks, and imagining the future.
In each episode, we bring you insightful discussions about cutting-edge technologies, the latest trends, actionable strategies, case studies, and novel insights that help your organization imagine its own future.
Whether you're a legal professional, a tech enthusiast, or simply curious about the future of law, this podcast is your gateway to understanding the profound changes AI will bring to the profession. Join us as we scale education and empower the legal community to thrive in an era of unprecedented innovation.
Welcome to 2030 Vision, AI and the Future of Law. Welcome back, everybody, to our regular podcast series, 2030 Vision, AI and the Future of Law. I'm your co-host, Jen Leonard. I am thrilled, as always, to be joined by Bridget McCormack, President and CEO of the American Arbitration Association. And today we're going to learn a lot about the American Arbitration Association and all of its efforts to integrate AI into the future of alternative dispute resolution. But just as a refresher, we decided to start this podcast series because we've had the opportunity to travel together to present to various legal audiences on our excitement about generative AI and what it means for the future of law. And we frequently sense a great deal of excitement and interest, but also an inability to understand where to go for more information, how to get started with understanding generative AI. And so we wanted to take some of those experiences as well as our shared experience teaching in a law school about generative technology and try to scale that knowledge and share what we've learned along the way, some resources, our mutual experiences working with generative AI, and also an optimistic perspective about how this can really transform legal services, legal education, and the practice of law for the better, recognizing that many thoughtful people are thinking about the risks and challenges inherent in moving forward in a generative AI era. So welcome to our learning journey. And to kick it off, each time we like to sort of share our Gen AI moment that we've had since our last conversation, those moments being the day-to-day sort of trials that we have with large language models and a magical sense of what they're capable of and some of the unexpected and surprising things that they do for us in these early days. So, Bridget, I'm going to turn it to you to share your Gen AI moment of the last couple of weeks.
Yep. Excellent. It's great to see you, Jen. I'm excited for today's conversation. And my Gen AI moment that I want to tell you about this week is actually one that one of my team members, Jason Cabrera, who works in our marketing department and is an assistant marketing manager, who has really embraced every generative AI tool he can to figure out how it can make his work more efficient, more enjoyable, and figure out what it can do well together with his guidance. And he recently took the class that the Artificial AI Institute offered. Paul Raitzer and Mike Kaput offered this online certification program. And Jason, I think, got his certification the very first day and was super proud of it. He posted it on LinkedIn, and Paul Raitzer actually commented on his LinkedIn post, which I think is very cool. I know. But Jason did a very cool thing. This certification was scaling AI within your organizations. That was the topic. And he decided that because the future of knowledge work is going to be so impacted by AI, that it makes sense for us to start thinking about the tasks that our knowledge workers do. And we've been doing this throughout the organization just by learning and cataloging and meeting, and we'll talk a lot about that later. But he gave a prompt to a couple different large language models, asking it to evaluate all of the tasks that he does in his job. He pulled them from our HR website, and to evaluate which of those tasks an LLM would be able to do 50% or more of with no additional tools. Then he asked it a second set of questions with giving it different additional tools, and had it make a matrix for him to figure out in the future which things he was going to have to do on his own that these LLMs were not going to help him with at all, and which things they were going to be able to help him with considerably with no extra effort or no extra tools, and which were somewhere in between. And he came up with this unbelievable matrix, and he sent it to me and to the rest of my leadership team, because he's proposing we do this internal academy where all of our staff can start thinking now about the ways their jobs might change and how they can take advantage of those changes for the better. So I thought that was just a really exciting use case for Jason to take the initiative on and decide he wants to help us lead in this additional way at the AAA. How about you? Do you have one from the last 2 weeks?
I do. I wanted to first congratulate Jason on the certification. That's really cool. And also his experience is something that I'm running into frequently in my own trial and error with LLMs, which is sometimes I think, can it do this? Can it do that? What would it be good for? And it doesn't even occur to me to actually ask the LLM itself. Like, the LLM can be really helpful in helping you understand how it works. So I love that Jason did that. That's very cool. My experience is not really a specific one this week, but more of a global experience working with the new Claude 3.5 Sonnet model that just came out a couple weeks ago. And you can upload files that are related to a project that you're working on, and you can see a side-by-side screenshot of your prompt and a very simple output. And then on the right, sort of a chain of thought as to how the LLM is generating the output. So you can go in and adjust your prompt if you're seeing something that's not totally what you were thinking about, or you're curious as to where it came from the LLM. And in my work with my partner, Marielle, we do a lot of creative projects, meaning we're legitimately creating the project from scratch and trying to create workshops and experiences. And we were starting with a blank page about a workshop that we were designing to achieve a certain learning goal. And we were just sort of racking our brains about how we would structure this. And then we opened it up on a shared screen and just gave it some context, gave it the learning goals, and said, what are some activities we could design for lawyers to learn about this? And she was amazed, as somebody I think who doesn't spend as much time looking at them. And I was amazed to see it on the split screen. And it's just so good with creative and strategic sort of problem solving and thought partnership. And again, and we're going to talk about this today with your experience, I think they work really best with creative ideas, and also things where you know enough to know which things are going to work and which aren't, where you're the expert. Because there were a few things where we were laughing, where like lawyers would roll their eyes all over the place at this. But there were a couple where we would have never come up with it on our own. And we found ways to adapt it for a legal audience. And it saved us a ton of time and really benefited our clients. So that was my Gen AI moment for the week.
That's great. I'm glad to hear about that. I haven't tried that yet, although I've been really impressed with this new version of Claude for the regular tasks that I use it for. So I'm excited to try that. That's one of the things that I do every day, right? So that's a really daily use case for lots of people. I'm glad to hear about it.
I'm also reminded as I'm saying this that I use it a lot for business strategy planning, and I had it sort of identify different revenue streams for the business. and
Yeah.
give me advice on how to develop a more strategic approach to the diverse service offerings that we have. And it was really interesting because the things where we have greater demand and more revenue tend to also be more discrete projects that are one and done. And it sort of advocated for coming up with a different way to prioritize projects for more sustainable projects, even if they're lower dollar value, if that makes sense. And it's logical. If I sat and thought about it, that would occur to me, but it's not generally the way I approach business development.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's another example of how it can be how it can be strategic in ways that human brains can take longer to get to. I agree, you would get there, but it just does it immediately, right? It does it kind of automatically. That's a real benefit of having it as a thought partner.
Yeah, it's very cool. I'm excited to hear your experience playing with it. But one of the other things that we wanted to do on our podcast was provide each episode a couple of concepts or terminology that are common in LLM spaces, but might be very alien to lawyers. And every week offer a couple of those for people to think about. And one of the ones that I wanted to toss to you, Bridget, because I think it leads into the work that you're doing at the AAA, is the idea of artificial intelligence that is probabilistic versus artificial intelligence that is deterministic. When people are talking about those two different terms, what do they mean?
Yeah. So probabilistic is when, and please jump in if you think I'm not answering this clearly enough, is when outputs are generated based on probability distribution. So each outcome can produce different results, even with the same prompt, the same question. And so there is some randomness and uncertainty involved. And it is, therefore, you could view it as flexible and creative, but also less predictable, which is, as you might imagine, quite disconcerting for lawyers. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about that. But most large language models like GPT and Claude are probabilistic models. And deterministic, of course, I'm sure most people are familiar with this, is when outputs are fixed for a given input. So no matter if you ask the same question 10 times, you're going to get the same answer. The outputs, like I said, are fixed. And there isn't, therefore, randomness involved in working with a deterministic AI. It's more consistent, it's reproducible, it's also less creative, can be a little less fun. But for some rule-based systems and some, AI systems, that is the best model. And you could imagine some contexts where that is the only model somebody would want to use. Do you think I missed something important in my telling of the difference there?
No, not at all. That's exactly how I would describe it. And I think most lawyers are used to artificial intelligence that is deterministic. If they're using it in their practice to date, they can look under the hood and develop an algorithm that, you give it certain inputs, it will give you an output. And it's part of the angst I think lawyers are feeling now is this is a different kind of technology. And it makes many of them, I think, very uncomfortable that you don't have that reliability of deterministic outputs.
Yeah, and we'll have this conversation over and over again, but it is interesting because obviously, humans are more probabilistic than deterministic, right? If you ask, I know you are a very smart lawyer. I think I am a fairly smart lawyer. You could ask us the same legal question, and like many legal questions, if there's nuance, we might give slightly different answers. We would certainly put them differently, but they might even be slightly different answers. And that's in some ways, what lawyers do is try and figure out the best answer to the question before them. But I do understand the discomfort in working with a technology that might not give you the same answer to the same question 30 seconds apart or 1 second apart. So it's interesting. How about the term hallucinations? Everybody talks about hallucinations, but what exactly does that term mean in the context of generative AI?
Yeah, and it's funny because hallucinations has become such a different word to me. And I used to think of it as like, a human being hallucinating something on drugs or something like that. But hallucinations have gained a lot of attention in the legal space because of this probabilistic model. And really, hallucinations, and correct me if I'm missing anything, the way these models are trained is essentially a predictor of the next most likely word or token in a vector of the language on which the models have been trained. And so there's not thought happening behind these predictive outputs. And sometimes what happens is the machine generates something that in its training is coming next in that series of words. But in the context of the questions we're asking the model, it doesn't make sense and appears to be completely made up. And of course, the most famous example that set us all back months in the conversation is the ChatGPT lawyer from last year, where the ChatGPT hallucinated a case name that didn't exist, and the lawyer filed a brief containing that case name with a federal court. But that's my understanding of hallucinations is that sort of probabilistic outcome that is non-existent in our sense of reality.
Yeah, and it's definitely been a significant stumbling block for a lot of, I think, uptake in legal. And understandably so. I did a presentation last week to the appellate judges in the state of Missouri, and I sort of did what you and I often do together, a state of the technology, and then, what are some of the immediate pros, some of the things you have to be looking out for. And hallucinations, and that one lawyer in New York who set us all back about 5 years was mostly what they knew about generative AI. So
it's funny, isn't it? I feel like maybe one of the reasons it's so troubling to lawyers is because, like you said, we are actually very probabilistic in the way that we write as humans. And it's interesting, as you were saying that, I was thinking back to very early days when lawyers would say that the value that we add is our own individual style and tone and bite to our writing, but it also seems to be the thing that makes lawyers uncomfortable. But we don't typically hallucinate. You might have a junior lawyer who doesn't understand the holding of a case or misses a nuance, but they're generally not submitting work product to a judge or a partner that has completely made up case names.
I think that's absolutely right. You don't see that. You do, however, I think sometimes with junior lawyers, or at least with brand new clerks, see, citations that are kind of miss the mark because, a brand new lawyer who might not understand the larger context in which the legal question arises just doesn't have the experience yet to kind of figure out what the why the answer might not be the best fit. But you're right. They don't usually make up. I have not had, I never had a clerk when I was on the bench make up a case name. So as far as I know.
As far as we know, for sure. So those are a couple of concepts that we thought might be helpful for people to understand. And I think both concepts, especially this probabilistic concept, are good things to keep in mind as we move into the next portion of our conversation, which is really learning from you, Bridget, about your efforts to lead new initiatives and to think differently about how AI will impact alternative dispute resolution. So for our next portion of the podcast, this will really be an interview by me of you so that the rest of our audience can learn what it actually looks like for an organization to become AI emergent. Again, to use Paul Reitzer's language. So if you're okay with it, I'll lead us through a series of questions to get a sense of what you and your team have been up to, which is a whole lot.
Yeah, let's do it. I think it'll be fun.
Okay. So just to level set, you are, as we mentioned at the beginning, the CEO and president of the American Arbitration Association. And many, many lawyers are familiar with the AAA, may have engaged with the AAA, particularly litigators. But just so everybody knows, can you just explain in simple terms what the American Arbitration does and what its mission is?
Yeah, the AAA is the largest provider of ADR services in the world, and we provide arbitration and mediation and other alternative dispute resolution services to parties who want to resolve disputes outside of courthouses. And that's lots of parties. And we do it across the United States, but also across the globe, as is probably not surprising to anybody listening. Cross-border transactions are very often, disputes about cross-border transactions are very often decided in arbitration because, of course, it would be complicated for any company to cede their dispute to another country's court system. So arbitration is a common way for cross-border transactions to resolve disputes. But domestically, it's also a choice that lots of businesses make. A lot of B2B contracts have ADR clauses in them that have arbitration as the way they will resolve disputes if there are disputes. And there are also arbitration clauses in lots of common consumer contracts. And the AAA has been a national leader on requiring due process protocols in contracts that are between businesses and consumers. Because obviously, if we're going to be providing dispute resolution services that courts enforce, they have to be fair and trustworthy. So that's what the AAA has been doing since 1926, almost 100 years. The AAA has been providing ADR services, and we provide a lot of them. Last year, we administered over 500,000 cases, just to give you a sense of how many cases are coming through the AAA every year. We have 28 offices across the United States, one in Singapore, and we have talented people working on all of those cases all the time. And it's a wonderful organization with really mission-driven people who, one of them described it as making the world a better place by giving people more and better tools to resolve disputes and get back to their lives and get back to business and often preserve relationships. So that's what the AAA is, and that's what it's been doing since 1926.
So 500,000 cases a year. I know your previous life was as Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. You have a lot of experience with state court administration and adjudication. How does that compare with the number of cases that are brought in state courts every year? Do you know?
I do. I mean, I at least can give you the Michigan numbers, and Michigan is a large state, but not the largest in terms of court dockets. But the Michigan courts administered between 3 and 4 million cases in a year. Of course, the criminal dockets are more significant, are heavier than the civil dockets. At the AAA, we do not do criminal cases. Obviously, these are all contract disputes. So, in terms of the civil dockets in the state courts, I am sure the AAA's docket is larger than some states and smaller than others, but it's not that dissimilar, to be honest.
And we know that volume in the civil courts, in state courts, creates all sorts of challenges to administering justice. And we could talk about that in a few minutes as we talk about your vision for the AAA. But just to stay at the intro for a minute. So two parties, generally companies, opt into private arbitration. So the data is not public, correct?
That's right. It's not
about the resolution. But you have 100 years of data around private dispute resolution.
Yeah, we do. And, we do lots of different kinds of cases, but there are certain caseloads where businesses have been using arbitration and AAA arbitration in particular for a very long time. The construction industry, for example, has had the AAA in most of its contracts for a very long time. So we have significant data even within certain kind of legal verticals, but lots of arbitration data.
And how many people work at the AAA globally? And it's also the International Center for Dispute Resolution as well, correct?
That's right. Yeah. The International Center for Dispute Resolution is our global arm and is a few decades old, but we have a talented team working for the ICDR. There are about 720 people who work for the AAA ICDR right now.
Wow. Great. So a big team, lots of volume, lots of data, and you stepped into the role as the leader of the organization about a little over a year and a half ago. And as you did, it was about 2 months after ChatGPT emerged, a couple months before GPT-4 came out. What did you start to see as you started to learn more about the organization and about emerging technologies that played into your strategy for the future of the AAA?
Yeah, you've heard me tell this, but I think it's worth laying it out. I accepted the job in September of 2022. That was, 2 months before ChatGPT was released into the wild. But I didn't start the job until February 2023. But it was pretty clear to me between November and February that there was significant change coming to the business of law, the practice of law, and therefore those of us who serve lawyers and their clients, and probably coming fast. So I, made it a point with my leadership team to say we're going to kind of dive in with all of our energy. We had a series of legal futurists come, educate us quickly about what was happening and where things looked like they were headed. And then we stood up, and we'll talk more about what all this looked like. Lots of teams to start learning in sort of different categories of the organization, because it was very clear that we had to figure it out and had to figure it out quickly.
And I know I was sort of had the opportunity to sit on the sidelines with some popcorn and watch you as you were, moving in this direction. And I remember asking you at a certain point, where did you find all of the colleagues who could help stand up all of these projects? And it sounds like you were really blessed and fortunate to come into an organization that was already doing a lot of innovation work.
Yeah, I should have said that. I feel incredibly lucky that the AAA had a robust, structured innovation program in place when I showed up. There was a vice president of innovation who has a team that that works for her and reports to her, and then everybody else across the organization within the first 2 months of my being there did 3 hours of innovation training. I mean, every single person who works there. And we have a wonderful platform called Bright Idea that connects everybody with ideas that they post and comment on and vote on. And we move those ideas to Go teams for design sprints and gather user data and input, customer discovery. And then we move things quickly through an innovation pipeline into practice. Just some of them are little changes that help our internal operations work better. Some are customer facing that are, just wonderful additions to what customers get from AAA already. But the practice, the structured, robust practice was luckily there. It didn't have to be built. I think if we had to build that would have been the first step. And we got to skip over that step because we had this platform that was a great one to springboard this new AI discovery off of.
That's really interesting. And it wasn't meant to be a course correction either to anything you said. It just made me think about, because I remember you had mentioned the 3 hours of innovation training, and I thought, where did that come from? And it came internally. And I know Bob Ambrogi, who's somebody else that we both follow, wrote an article recently about the haves and have-nots in legal spaces, and the ones that have like really big, robust teams right now have an upper hand in thinking about these things. And yet, I mean, it still requires enormous leadership and enormous change management to shift the goalposts a little bit. And it's funny because I was preparing for a Gen AI presentation the other day for lawyers and judges, pretty well educated, sophisticated group. And somebody said, we need to slow down because this is going to scare a lot of people. And my response was sort of, I think these people can handle this. I mean, their training is to handle people's biggest challenges. And I think everybody's a grown up and can navigate this. But how did you have conversations to clarify, the new vision, which was new to everybody, and bring people along? And what advice would you have for other organizations where they're maybe afraid to freak people out?
Yeah, I do think that not freaking people out is actually an ongoing challenge. I think the senior team, even on the talented senior team, there were some skeptics at the start, right? Skeptics who thought, I remember one of my team members who's unbelievably valuable saying, "Yeah, and I remember when the blockchain was going to change everything, and that never happened." And so there are skeptics at every level, but I think the fear is that if in fact this new technology is going to really disrupt knowledge work, is it going to disrupt my job? And that's kind of an ongoing issue that I think it's really important to be communicating pretty regularly with all of your teams about. But in terms of the strategy for the organization, I mean, in a way, we were lucky. We had a new CEO, right? The last CEO had been in the seat for 10 years. And the last, strategic planning process was, 6 or 7 years ago, interrupted, of course, by a pandemic that changed everybody's strategic plans for a little while there. And so it was actually probably lucky that we had, I show up and we're at an inflection point anyway. So it makes sense for us all to roll up our sleeves and figure out, what does this look like? And what does it mean for what we've done traditionally and what we might do next? And let's think pretty expansively and creatively, because it, in our view, it gives us the opportunity to do that. It also was important to us to involve everybody. And so one of the things we did was we set up these user groups for anybody who wanted to raise their hand, and we got them the $20 a month GPT licenses, and then eventually Claude licenses. And, as the tools became available, we had, some people from legal, but some were case managers, and some were from the innovation teams, and some were from IS, and they were all using it regularly and uploading the use cases that they were discovering, and then having these regular meetings to move some of the ideas that they came up with into the innovation pipeline for formal processing. We did the same thing with a group of our panelists. The AAA has over 5,000 panelists. They are independent contractors. They're not employees, but they're important to us. They're part of our community. It's important to us that they are, well supported and well trained. We asked for a group of them also to raise their hands, and we got them some of the legal tools, the LLM tools that were built for lawyers. We got them co-counsel licenses, and then eventually VLEX licenses, and more recently ClearBrief licenses, so that they could do the same thing, experiment with it, have meetings, upload use cases to a shared site. They've now written a paper and done presentations about what they've learned and the ways in which they've found that it really can impact their practices in a positive way. And then when GPT-4 started coding last April, my very talented IS and innovation leader, Diana Didia, who you've met, figured, okay, well, I guess now our engineers are going to also have to start figuring out what this means, because if it gives them significantly more capacity and also is going to become important for what we build in the future, we want to make sure that our team are the ones who learn how to build it. And like every other thing about the technology, it didn't come with a manual. There was no here's how you learn to code with these tools. But so our engineers did the same thing. We did bring in some help, but we made sure everybody had the information they needed to start basically experimenting.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions about what you just said, and I'm not sure exactly which direction to go in. So I'll start with the last one that I wrote. I get the chance to visit with a lot of different organizations who are thinking about innovation broadly and Gen AI specifically. Many of those organizations are law firms, which I think are somewhat uniquely situated in the sense that if they take their foot off the billable hour gas, they are letting go of revenue in the short term to try to figure this out. And so that might be slightly different from the AAA, but I also imagine in any organization, you're asking people to carve out some time, either in addition to or replacing things that they're used to doing or feel a real obligation to do. Was that a challenge as you were leading the organization to help people feel supported to do that?
I do. It's a great question. And I think really important to call attention to it, because everybody feels overworked all the time because they do work incredibly hard. We have a really committed staff and they work really hard. I always, when I ask folks to come to an all-team webinar, I always apologize. I say, I understand that you're giving me this hour, and that means you're going to do an hour's worth of work some other time. And I know that's important. And they have innovation goals, and their innovation goals and KPIs can be satisfied by some of this participation in this generative AI company-wide discovery. So we also allow them to get training hours based on listening to this podcast, for example. So they can do generative AI learning to satisfy some of their work goals, and that feels pretty important to us, to make sure that you make it as easy and attractive as possible for people to do it, and not just feel burdened. But it's also something we've talked about at the senior level a lot. If we're asking people to do this, we have to make sure they have the room to do it, right? You've heard stories of, IBM, I think, gave everybody like a day a week for innovation and coming up with like new projects. And how you make space for people and time for people is pretty important if you want people to do something other than what they have to do every day, which is always a lot. So yeah, it's a constant conversation. Not saying we've solved it, but we're always talking about it.
I love that. And it makes me think of another sort of common challenge with organizations and innovation, which is step one, especially in legal, is to get people to tap into their creativity and ideation and just like feel comfortable and supported coming up with new ideas. But then sometimes that can get out of control and everybody has an idea about how we could do everything better. It sounds like maybe you have some mechanism and matrices that you use to select pilot projects. And I'm sure that listeners would be curious how you select from all these great ideas, which ones to pursue.
Yeah, we do. And again, we're lucky to have this structured innovation program because that's, given us a lot of opportunity to build muscle around how to get the information you need to decide whether you want to invest more in any idea that comes through. So not just generative AI ideas that come through our pipeline, although now we have so many of those. We're applying those same matrices and same sort of checklists to those ideas, but all ideas. So, like you said, you can get people so good at ideating that you have far more ideas than you have resources to pursue. And how do you sort of choose between them? So that's a pretty important part of our innovation pipeline and that's why we have go teams and design sprints and ways to get input, quick and dirty input from users before we move forward with anything. Our approach to the generative AI ideas, which we have so many of them now, is a little bit different right now than a traditional kind of cost benefit analysis, because we are all learning. We're learning some new things that make a little more experimentation at this stage worthwhile, because we know that the training for the engineers who are building the new products and tools is pretty important for getting ready for bigger bets. So we're willing to build things that are just going to cost time from engineers and from innovation leaders who are getting feedback from users and aren't going to bring in any revenue at all, but they're still valuable at this stage. And then otherwise, I think some of the questions do fit into the traditional buckets about how we decide which ideas to move forward with. We now have to have a separate generative AI steercom. We have a steercom meeting once a week to go through that list and where we are, because sometimes there are some trade-offs. Like, do we want to put significantly more resources? We have 2 projects at, step 3 in what might be a 10-step process, and we're going to have to make a hard call about which one we pursue. Or do we want to slow down all of them to pursue a much bigger bet? And how do you prepare for the bigger bets while you're learning? So there's a lot of kind of complication around it. I think that having a excited and talented team is the whole ball game, honestly. Like, it's not something anybody could do by themselves. Like, you need your whole leadership team involved in these conversations.
Well, that's a perfect transition to the next question I have, which is, you said at the outset you involve everybody. I think some organizations have the misconception that the technology department alone can solve these problems and then figure out how to train people on them, roll out new technology. And so I have sort of two questions. One, just dispel that notion for us and describe why this technology does not work that way. And two, I've seen, and I'm not saying you see this in your organization, but I've seen a lot of burnout on the part of CTOs because they, of course, are learning this technology for the first time too. It's very weird and it's so transformative, and the teams frequently are not sized appropriately to really be figuring out transformation for the whole organization. So I guess number one, why is it so important to bring everybody along? And number two, how do you support the technologists in your organizations in navigating this area and feeling supported?
Yeah, they're both excellent questions. I have said, you've heard me, in a lot of our presentations together, it's not your IS department, your IT department is not your R&D lab with this technology. It's your entire staff. Everybody is your R&D lab. Jason Cabrera in marketing is, doing like incredible R&D work for us right now. He's just figuring out what are the ways in which this can really impact our jobs in a positive way, so we can move the parts of the job that the technology can do easily to the technology, and we can do the other parts that make a difference for the users who depend on us. And that's true of the HR director, and it's true of every case manager who has an idea that all of a sudden, hey, what if we gave the parties a tool that we built with, this new technology that would let them search all of our panelists and find who's the best fit for them by having a natural language conversation with them. The customer service team that really knows what people struggle with, they're really important to your R&D effort. So there is no way that a technology that anybody can get immediate use out of right now. You don't have to go to your IS department and say, hey, can you enable this thing so I can do it? Everybody is important to the effort. How you support your IS teams or IT teams, we call it IS, so I know some people call it IT, is a really important thing to start talking about early, because again, there's no manual, there's not really like a training program for engineers. They're all learning together on GitHub and like learning from one another about how to figure all this out, but giving them the freedom to learn, and some time to learn, and some time to play with the tools, and some support to the extent you can do that. We have some consultants in Tel Aviv that we let our lead generative AI engineer Yogesh meet with their lead generative AI engineer Yoel, and they can basically talk to one another about the weird things they're discovering. And we have always traditionally had a bigger offshore bench to support our IS team in just building when we have more to do than we have capacity in-house. And that team has actually been crucial in giving us support. But I think that, resources it is very smart to probably think about resourcing your IS teams and your data team, if you have one, to give some serious consideration to sending resources that way. So we've been doing a lot of that.
Okay, so wanted to shift gears a little bit and still focused on all the efforts you have underway. But one of the sort of leading pieces of literature on innovation that you and I both have been drawn to is Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma idea that when you're in a really highly structured historical institution, it tends to be set up to serve a specific world that may no longer exist when new technology comes to the fore. And you recently have decided as an organization to make an acquisition of ODR.com and Resourceful Internet Solutions. And so I'm curious why you made that decision and how it plays into broader principles around strong innovation.
Yeah, this has been a really exciting time for us in acquiring the ODR team and the RIS team. I don't use the word acquiring, even though that's technically what happened. We really feel like we've just found, a new set of partners for scoping out and planning for the future of dispute resolution. As I said before, we've been really busy at the AAA before we joined forces with this team at ODR and RIS, building our own generative AI tools. We have tools for our customers. We have tools for our teams in-house. We're putting them out to market. We can talk about those eventually, but we're going full steam ahead on finding tools that both make our internal operations better, faster, stronger, and our services to users better, faster, stronger. But at the same time, the ways in which we have served the market of businesses, organizations, individuals who want different ways to resolve disputes than traditional litigation have been in pretty in the same lanes. We do a lot of arbitration. We are called the American Arbitration Association after all. And mediation, of course, has been around for a long time, but there's going to be, more and more demand for new ways to resolve disputes. I mean, people have been resolving disputes on the Amazon platform and the eBay platform with a basically automated decision maker and an ODR process for a couple of decades now, and it's going just fine. And there are lots of disputes that might be better resolved with a lighter touch, faster, quicker, less expensive process than even arbitration or mediation, which are significantly less expensive than litigation, but still, they might not be exactly the right fit for every dispute. As Colin Rule, the CEO at ODR.com says, we want to fit the forum to the fuss. And sometimes, like an ODR product, an online dispute resolution product with a mediator or not, you could imagine parties, trying to resolve it even without involving a mediator, but having an option for a mediator might be a better forum for a particular fuss. And that's probably going to be true even for many of our legacy clients. You could imagine legacy businesses who will continue to want to use traditional arbitration services for some bet the company disputes, right? They're going to want human beings to look witnesses in the eye and hear them, describe whatever happened to make those really difficult decisions. And those same users might have other disputes where a totally different process will make far more sense. An online process, a faster process, a quicker process. And that's why this particular acquisition made a whole lot of sense for us, because we can continue with this new team to enhance our legacy services and products, which, I think we kind of fit the Clayton Christensen model of a successful legacy organization. And we can continue to do what we do and grow that core, but at the same time, build this new set of businesses for resolving disputes. That is pretty exciting because lots of disputes that maybe just didn't have a place to go before, I think will in the future, given this technology. And we think we're the perfect organization to be there to provide it.
I think that's so cool, both because I love to see the theories in that work come to life and have somebody actually doing what Christensen prescribes in that book. But also because I think it's a good lesson of this era of we're so driven by loss aversion and fear of losing what we have or losing our existing jobs. And what you're doing feels to me like you're not only growing the work of your internal team that already exists, but finding non-disruptive, creative ways to grow new opportunities across the organization and for the broader world, right? So that's very cool.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's like you want to make sure you can continuously improve what it is you do right now. That's really important. And so, but you can spend all your time doing that. But you have to at the same time be launching these new solutions for the customers who use your old solutions right now, in case they want those for some of their needs. So it's really fun to be able to doing it all. And And honestly, the two teams really get to leverage one another. I've said like 1 and 1 makes a whole lot more than 2 in this case, because it's really fun to think about what we can build together. So
it's also another one of, I think, our mutual friends. Ben Barton has written with Judge Stephanos Bibas of the Third Circuit, Rebooting Justice. I don't know how long ago that book came out, 10 years ago, about online dispute resolution, drawing inspiration from eBay. And so I'm sure they are very excited to see this come to life. Was that part of your inspiration for thinking this through?
yeah, I mean, Colin Rule, who's the CER at ODR.com, is kind of basically the grandfather of online dispute resolution. And he and Ben Barton were roommates in college. I don't know if you knew that. Yeah.
No.
Colin is not a lawyer. He's not a lawyer. But I don't know anybody who cares more about alternative dispute resolution than Colin Rule. But Ben Barton wrote of him, I wish I had the quote up, something like, he's the most dangerous kind of entrepreneur. He said, he's not that great of a technologist. He's not a lawyer. He's not really an expert in, how lawyers resolve disputes, but he's the most dangerous type of entrepreneur, a true believer. He really believes in the mission of giving people better tools to resolve disputes in ways that, preserve as much of, what they want to preserve as possible. So yeah, Colin Rule was an inspiration for Ben Barton. I had Ben Barton speak to the Michigan judiciary at our all judge conference 5 or 6 years ago. So it's kind of fun for me to now be working with Colin.
That is a very cool fun fact. I love Ben Barton. And mission-driven entrepreneurs and change makers are very hard to dissuade and deter. So that's amazing. And I would put firmly in that category of a mission-driven change maker. And I know for a very long time, you have been sounding the alarm bell about the civil justice crisis and the access to legal services, including dispute resolution for the average person and small business. So how does this acquisition and your broader strategic vision for the AAA align with your longstanding goals to really make some movement and progress in that arena?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it all, the generative AI moment informs all of it and makes it all that much more exciting. Yeah, I won't bore you with the numbers, but the 92% of Americans can't afford legal help with their civil justice problems, and that includes not only small businesses but also most medium businesses. Most medium businesses are legally naked; they just can't afford lawyers, so they do their best to muddle through what we know is a weird language with weird rules that are hard to find. In fact, they're sometimes hidden. That's kind of unfair, and therefore many civil disputes people try to navigate on their own and then they just give up on. I think this new technology and, a mission-driven entrepreneur like Colin Rule who wants to, change the way humanity resolves disputes, gives us an opportunity to reach this big blue ocean that lawyers couldn't fish in before, right? I think there are going to now be tools for providing an operating system for people to resolve disputes and for lawyers, frankly, to help them, creative lawyers who want to help them with new business models. That to me is really exciting. It feels like perhaps the breakthrough that those of us who care about access to justice have been, thinking about and talking about for a long time. You very much among them. So I am excited that with the team at ODR.com, we're going to be able to probably stand up processes that are fast and fair and trustworthy for disputes that typically people gave up on or tried to navigate on their own and were dissatisfied with where it took them.
Very cool. And I'm going to sort of steal this line of reasoning to respond to future allegations that I'm making people feel too afraid, lawyers and judges who have serious obligations to society, and frame it in this way. I also love all the emerging vocabulary from legally naked to form that fits the fuss. I love that. One example that I wanted to focus on, because I know I've seen you share it on social media, I've heard you talk about it, but I think it's a helpful thing for people to crystallize in their mind, is this clause builder that the AAA has developed using generative technology. Can you describe what the clause builder is and what it does?
Yeah, absolutely. The Clause Builder AI tool, which went live a few weeks ago, we had it in beta for a while while we were fine tuning it, is a version of our legacy clause builder tool. We had a tool for people who wanted to put together an arbitration clause or a mediation clause, an alternative dispute resolution clause for a contract, using a traditional drop-down choice box methodology, because lots of people, like I said, not just individuals, but many businesses have non-lawyers trying to make sure their contracts are going to serve them in the future in case there's a dispute. And you need an ADR clause that the courts are going to uphold, right? So we had a tool that helped people with that, a legacy tool. And it occurred to us pretty early in this, in our exploration of where we could go with this generative AI technology, that we could use a library of perfected clauses, which we have because we review clauses all the time for businesses who want to make sure they comply with our due process protocols if they're going to want us to adjudicate their cases one day. And we also have all this other experience with clauses that are going to be upheld by courts. And we trained on that data using, again, the GPT LLM, and created a natural language interface. So somebody can now come to Clause Builder AI and they can say, I have an employment contract. I am looking for a clause that will have us go to mediation, or mediation followed by arbitration if the mediation doesn't, resolve the dispute. And it will then have a conversation back with you and ask you all the other kinds of things you might want to include. You might not, but it'll give you options to make sure that you're writing the clause, or you're writing the clause together with the tool that will meet exactly your needs in the event there's a dispute. We trained it on that data internally. We then had a lot of internal users practicing with it and trying to trick it, giving it harder questions. We then had a lot of external users. Anybody interested in our work, we're always looking for people to help us with fine-tuning these tools. And when we got comfortable enough that it was, again, it's probabilistic, not deterministic, but when we got comfortable enough with the answers it was giving, we put it up for the public to use. It's obviously not something it's not a revenue stream for us. It's a service like the legacy tool was. But to the extent we can give more people more tools to resolve disputes better, that's part of our mission. So it's a pretty exciting one. We had one other tool before that we started using a few months ago. We have an automated scheduling order after a preliminary hearing in an arbitration. We trained a tool on a bunch of scheduling orders that were used in previous cases, and now we use the Zoom transcript from a preliminary hearing. It has this library that it's trained on, and it produces a draft scheduling order. So the arbitrator spends a lot less time putting together the scheduling order, and the parties therefore pay less. I think the next one that we're working on is this filing chatbot, a natural language interface for people filing cases who might not understand the process yet. That's one that I'm pretty excited about, especially for users that don't have lawyers. And then the one after that, I think, is we have a long list of these. Is the panelist search tool. We're going to give both our case managers who are trying to put together lists of potential arbitrators for disputes or mediators, and then eventually users to be able to have a natural language interface with our data. So it's pretty exciting what you can build.
That's amazing. And it's a good full circle moment to our definitions at the beginning, because the way you're describing it, I think, with the clause builder was moving from deterministic with the drop-down menus to probabilistic using generative AI.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And, again,
so it can be done.
It can be done. You can fine tune it to a point where it doesn't have to give you the exact same words in the exact same order to be a good clause. So.
Well, amazing work, Bridget. It's just incredibly interesting to watch, and super interesting as somebody who studies the theory of these different ways to advance innovation to see somebody actually doing the hard work to make it happen. Anything else that you wanted to share about your vision, about the experience?
No, except to say, I feel like I just dove into the deep end of a pool and was lucky enough to have, a talented team that was like, all right, I guess we're diving into the deep end. Let's do it. But it's been really helpful for me to collaborate with you to put the theory around some of what sometimes you'll say something. I'm like, hey, that kind of sounds like what I'm doing. So I appreciate that I get to collaborate with somebody who's so smart about the sort of the theory and the structure to put around what we're up to.
Well, that's overly kind and generous toward me, but I'll take it and thank you very much. And I think that the last thing that we had to talk about, which I actually think really dovetails nicely with your experiences, we like to share resources with people where they can learn more. I don't think we need to drill too far down into. We've talked about Ethan Mollick before, who has a great Substack called One Useful Thing. It's a great way to sort of be guided, and he talks in one recent edition about your employees being your R&D unit across your organization, and you talked about that. So check out Ethan's Substack for sure. But the other resource I wanted to just close with is this recent LinkedIn Microsoft study that came out, I think in May, about knowledge work and AI. And you could take it for what it is. Microsoft obviously has sort of a vested interest in the Gen AI world, but it shows that over 70% of knowledge workers are actively using AI, whether your organization has AI or not. And I think the quote was only 60% of organizations are actively thinking about a Gen AI strategy. And something like this might be from a different study, 5% of organizations have formal training in place to teach workers about generative AI. So I look at that as just validation for organizations that are fearful or skeptical that like this is here, it's not going anywhere, your people are using it, so you have the opportunity to shape how they use it, or they're just going to go rogue and use it however they think is most helpful. But what were your takeaways from the study?
Yeah, that was that was the main one, and that's exactly what I said to the judicial audience I met with last week. And I think I've been saying it for some time, but I feel like now I can say it with citation to a study. But I said you definitely have people on your teams who are using this technology, and if you want to make sure that they're using it in the way that you think is appropriate, it might make sense to figure out how a strategy could help your organization, and also what the costs would be of not putting a strategy together. And I think people are convinced by that in a way they might not be convinced by what some of the potential upsides are yet. They shut down pretty easily when they understand what hallucinations are and the fact that hallucinations are still a risk. They think, oh well, then I don't really have to figure this out. It's not ready for prime time, therefore it's not really appropriate for lawyers. But when you can tell them that there are definitely people on their teams doing it, and they probably want to figure out if they're doing it in ways that are appropriate, that kind of gets their attention. So I'm kind of happy for the survey to be able to use in a slide. So appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, I'm gonna this has been helpful to me because I'm gonna fold this into that presentation next week where I'm not supposed to scare anybody. So this will be maybe scary, but also I think important. And I think I don't have the exact statistic in front of me from the study, but I think 46% or something of the people that responded that they are using this started using it in the last 6 months. So the movement is only accelerating, which I was curious about whether adoption would continue to accelerate, but it definitely seems like it is.
And I mean, maybe we talked about this last week. I can't remember, or if we talked about it offline, but since we know from the Apple Dev Day that it's soon going to be in all of our phones, I don't see how organizations don't develop a strategy right now. I mean, all of your employees have iPhones; they're all going to be using it. So,
yeah, 100%. So thank you so much for sharing your experience, Bridget. Kudos to all of you. Shout out to Jason. I feel like he's my friend because we listen to the same podcast. So it's nice to grow the community, and congratulations to him on his certification. And thank you to everybody for joining us and learning along with us and learning from Bridget and her team and their great work at the AAA. And we'll be back with our next edition to share resources, definitions, case studies, and just conversation that we think is interesting and other people might too. So thank you, Bridget, for sharing.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to 2030 Vision, AI and the Future of Law. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our podcast and leave a review. Stay informed and inspired as we continue to explore the AI-driven future of the legal profession. We'll see you next time.